Okay. Okay. Hi there. This is the video for Egypt. The video on Egypt. Yay. Um, so let me give you a little sort of indication of what we're going to be doing. I'm going to go over the sort of give you an overview of the major periods of Egyptian history. I'm going to talk about the geography of the Nile and its impact on Egyptian culture. I'm going to talk about the evolution of Egyptian religious belief and then a little wrap it all up with what I'm going to call the legacy of Egypt. So awesome. Totally. Oh, wow. Right? Hi there. I'm back. Um, so Egypt has an extremely long history. It's very Egyptian history begins. It enters an age of writing. It enters its Bronze Age right around the same time as things are getting cooking in Mesopotamia. Um, this is one of the reasons that we regard the Nile River Valley as one of the cradles of civilization, where things get happening as early as they can, right around 3,500 to 3,000 or so. Um, the first, uh, the first indications we have of Egypt as a unified society are under a guy called Narmer, 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 who is regarded as the first pharaoh. Pharaoh, of course, will be a term you've heard of, and it's basically the same as autocrat from our discussions in the Mesopotamia videos. The pharaoh is an autocrat believed to be divine, related to the gods, the reason the sun came up, and all this other stuff. But anyway, the first pharaoh was Narmer, the first one to unite Upper and Lower Egypt, as they call it. Upper Egypt, by the way, is Egypt in a higher elevation, not Egypt north on the map. Like North Dakota, South Dakota, we look at a map and North Dakota is above South Dakota. But this is Upper and Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt is below Lower Egypt because it's at a higher elevation. It's up. It's literally upper. Anyway, Narmer unites Upper and Lower Egypt in around 3100 and kicks off the early period of Egyptian history. Uh, After a few hundred years, uh, we enter into a period of stable dynasties that is referred to as the Old Kingdom period. Uh, the Old Kingdom period. Obviously, I'm giving you approximate dates, not exact dates, because it's not really important that you know the exact dates. This is just for your knowledge, or just for your general orientation to this. And that lasts about 500 years when things get shaken up and we move into the Middle Kingdom period, which lasts about another 500 years, and then the New Kingdom period that lasts about another 500 years. The New Kingdom period ends with the Bronze Age collapse, which is something we're going to talk about more later. Uh, Bronze Age collapse. We're going to talk about that more later. Um, but the New Kingdom period ends with the Bronze Age collapse there in about 1000. And then after a few hundred years, Egypt gets itself back together and enters what is called the late period until 332. That 332 is when it is conquered by Alexander. We'll talk about him later. Uh, and then the reign of Alexander's heirs lasts from about 332 to 30 BCE in what's called Ptolemaic Egypt. And then in 30 BCE, Egypt is just turned into a province of Rome, and it's not really its own thing anymore. So, okay. Um, so that's sort of our overview of time periods. From this, hold on a moment. So where were we? All right. So what we see here then is an Egypt that lasts for roughly, because we go from 3100 with Narmer to 30 BCE. So over 3,000 years from beginning of to the end of Egyptian culture as its own distinctive thing, we get 3,000 years of Egyptian culture, which is honestly just really remarkable. Uh, that in the same time period, there are, good Lord, in Mesopotamia, you get the Sumerians and the Akkadians and the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Hittites and the Neo-Babylonians and the Neo-Assyrians. And I mean, there's just all kinds of different groups that rise and fall, and civilizations come into being and then end and are forgotten. But through it all, through 3,000 years of history, Egypt, although the culture did evolve and grow over a period of time, through 3,000 years of history, Egypt remains Egypt. It remains itself. It remains more or less the same in a lot of fundamental and important ways for that entire time. And understanding how and why that happened is going to be crucial to understanding anything about Egyptian history. So, and that's going to be our focus on this video. So that brings us nicely to the geography of the Nile and its impact on Egyptian culture. Because the short answer to how does Egypt remain the same for so long is the Nile. And the long answer is the rest of this video. So anyway, um, the Nile River runs for hundreds of miles in length from the Mediterranean up into the mountains in the southern part of what we call Upper Egypt, um, where it comes to a series of waterfalls or cascades, as they're referred to. Um, the Nile runs for hundreds of miles in length, but the habitable area around it, it cuts through desert, seriously arid, and in places in Upper Egypt, rocky landscape. Uh, the Nile River, the floodplain that it creates of habitable land around it is only a few miles wide. So Egypt, this great society, this great state that grew up along the banks of the Nile River, lived in a very narrow band of land, only a few miles wide, the kind of place you can literally walk east to west. You can walk from one side of settled Egypt to the other in less than a day. Obviously, probably a few hours at most. And if you could cross the Nile, and but then it was hundreds of miles long. So there was a lot of Egypt in terms of total area, but it was very narrow, right? It was very narrow, all on the banks of the Nile, from the north part where the Nile feeds into the Mediterranean, all the way down to where the Nile ascends into the mountains. Okay, or descends from the mountains, I guess, more accurately. On either side of the Nile is unforgiving desert. On the south of it are, of course, as mentioned, the mountains. On the north is the Mediterranean Sea. What kind of society does this produce? Well, there are a number of ways in which the geography of the Nile shapes Egyptian culture. One way is that the Nile resulted in an isolated culture. Egypt was not easy to reach. Once it was unified, the external factors, any external forces, the only way they could get to Egypt were to march across the desert or come in via the sea onto the deltas of the Nile River where it feeds into the Mediterranean, or come over the mountains. Those are the only ways you could get to Egypt, really. So Egypt was physically isolated from other cultures around it in the Mediterranean area or in Mesopotamia. Egypt was physically isolated. It was extremely difficult to access Egypt, difficult to invade Egypt. In that 3,000 years of history, there's one time that Egypt gets invaded right around the Middle Kingdom era, and that one doesn't count super much. Here, let me make it mark in black. That one doesn't count super much because the invaders just became Egyptian. They took on Egyptian culture and just became Egyptian. Alexander the Great, of course, conquers it in 332. But again, the Ptolemies, the people who inherited Egypt from Alexander, the Ptolemies ruled in Egypt, and they ruled as Egyptians again. It's not until 30 BCE that Egypt really is compromised in its culture. So for 3,000 years, Egyptian culture remains more or less the same because it only gets really invaded twice, and neither time to any great effect. Neither time did any invasion of Egypt manage to produce a significant change to Egyptian culture. So the isolation that we get because of the Nile, the geography of the Nile, is a major factor in Egyptian culture. It helped keep Egyptian culture stable and safe from outside influences. Another major way that the geography of the Nile influences Egyptian culture is that the Nile floods on a very regular schedule. This is because of the way that it descends from the mountains in a series of cascades or cataracts, these waterfalls. The way that it descends from the mountains means that every spring it floods at pretty much exactly the same time. And the floodwaters are gentle, spreading out over the land around the Nile River and fertilizing it with silt from the bottom of the river. The fertile soil that's good for growing in on the bottom of the river. When the flooding happens, it gets spread on the lands around Egypt. And even now, to this day, we're talking 5,000 years after Narmer united Egypt. Even now, farmers in Egypt depend upon the flooding of the Nile in that same fashion to irrigate and fertilize the lands around the Nile River. It's remarkable. The regularity of the flooding of the Nile gave the Egyptians a certain sense of order to the world. Things happen in an orderly fashion. Every year, the life-giving river floods in the same way at the same time and fertilizes these fields on either side of the river. And it just gave them this idea that the universe was an orderly place. Egyptian religion, which we're going to talk about in more detail coming up soon. Egyptian religion is founded on the concept of a universal order, a ma'at, as it's called, that a logic that sort of orders all of the universe and that everything operates on this principle. The sun rises and sets in a certain way because of the great machine of the universe is the way that it works. And the gods, the sun god rides his boat across the sky and then into the underworld through the night. And everything happens on this regular schedule and in this regular basis. It gave the Egyptians an idea that time was cyclical. That is to say, that time moved in cycles. The Egyptians believed that the universe was constantly going through the same pattern of events over and over and over. That it was moving through, it would, the same things would happen. You would start with a good pharaoh and things would be prosperous for a while, and then you get a mediocre pharaoh and things would be okay, and then there would be a bad pharaoh and things would get bad, and there would be famine and disease and warfare, and then after a period of bad things, the universe would right itself again and there would come a good pharaoh again. And this isn't just a belief that history moved in cycles. This was a belief that the same events were taking place over and over again with just different people and different players involved. So Egyptians, because of the Nile and the regularity of the Nile, Egyptians believed that the universe was a very stable, cyclical, ordered kind of place, and that everything happened in its own way for its own reasons. Okay. Was this an unusual belief? A little bit. The Egyptians were regarded by other cultures in the ancient world as being a little bit weird. They were considered a bit strange by everyone else. The Egyptians thought that Egypt was the center of the universe and that everything happened in this sort of orderly fashion and that, you can't really change anything and nothing ever really is different. And, it was considered a little weird. But we can kind of see why. The United States of America has been around for, 250 years. 250 years the United States of America has been around. Before us, I guess you could say it was England who had the colonies over here. And the kingship of England only stretches back, the feudal kingship of England in that regard only stretches back to 1066. So that's about 1,000 years now. Take all that history from the first, when the Normans invade England in 1066 and start the Kingdom of England, and all the way up through the colonies and America. Take all that history, 1,000 years of history. If you look at 1,000 years of history in Egypt, it's all just Egypt. Like Narmer unites it in 3100. And if we came in 2000 BCE and said 1,000 years later, if we came in 1,000 years later and we said, oh, well, who lives here now? We go, the Egyptians. Oh, what religion do they practice? Pretty much the same as Narmer's. Oh, what language do they speak? Pretty much the same as Narmer. Oh, okay. How do they dress? How do they farm their fields? Pretty much the same as they did 1,000 years ago. Oh, wow. I mean, yeah, the Egyptians had this weird idea that nothing ever changed, but in Egypt, kinda nothing ever changed. A little bit, not completely bonkers. Anyway. But that's partially due to the influence of the Nile. The yearly flooding of the Nile was so regular that the Egyptians based their calendar around it. One of the first groups of people to use a solar rather than lunar calendar. Um, it was just a hugely significant impact on Egyptian culture. And obviously, the Nile River impacted Egyptian culture in another way, in that it was the reason why Egypt could be united. If we look at Mesopotamia with its two rivers that flood irregularly and sometimes violently, and they are intercut with little streams and irrigation canals and things like that, um, there's no single lifeline, if you will, in Mesopotamia. This is why you could get different cityscapes rising in different areas of Mesopotamia. Um, Sometimes far enough away from each other that, when Babylon was becoming, powerful, the cityscape of Assur was far enough away from it that they couldn't immediately, stop them from Babylon from becoming powerful, and then it did, and it overthrew the Assyrians. And anyway, in the in Egypt, everyone who lives in Egypt is within stone throwing distance of the river. This means that a powerful pharaoh who can maintain the presence of ships moving up and down the Nile can communicate quickly, can trade quickly, can enforce his will quickly on everyone living in Egypt. Um, if everyone lives near the banks of this river, and that river is your main source of communication and travel and everything else, then if someone can control the river, then they can control the whole damn thing. They can control all of Egypt, all hundreds and hundreds of miles of it, because it's so narrow, it's so close to the river. So the geography of the Nile shaped the culture in that it gave the Egyptians a sense of repetitiveness, a sense of stability in their culture. B, it helped isolate them and protect them from outside influences. And then C, it also was the whole reason why you could create a unified Egypt in the first place, because the Nile made for an excellent source or means of communication and travel through that entire settled area. So the geography of the Nile was determinative of the culture of Egypt in basically every important way. Okay, let's look at Egyptian religion, the evolution of Egyptian religious belief. Okay. Um, Egyptian religious belief goes through three periods that are roughly in line with the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom periods. Um, the three phases of development in Egyptian religion roughly align with those periods. So, um, to start with, the Egyptians were polytheists. We talked about that in the Mesopotamia video, what polytheism is. If you don't know, you should know, because you should have watched the Mesopotamia video if you've gotten to this one. Haha. The Egyptians were polytheists. They were henotheists. Again, something we talked about in the other video. They lived in a theocentric culture with a transactional religion. The worship of their gods was meant to get things done, just like with the Mesopotamians. There were a lot of local gods, lots and lots of local gods. all up and down the Nile. And sometimes, depending on events, some local gods would become more important, and worship of them would spread throughout the entire Nile Valley. Um, that happens. There were some changes in their main god was a sun god called Ra. That was originally their main god. Later on, as Egyptian religion develops further, Ra will be. There's actually legends of Ra getting old and senile and being replaced by another god. So that happened. Um, uh, Horus becomes an important god, the son of Ra. Anyway, the important element, though, is this, that much like the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians originally did not believe in an afterlife of any kind of significant afterlife for most people. There was a realm of the dead, but that's where what's left of you goes when you die, and it's not like a paradise or like a hell or anything like that. It's just like a storage space. What's left of you goes there, and you get stuck there, and that's it. There's no afterlife. You don't enjoy things. You don't have an afterlife. You don't party. You don't do anything like that. Um, in the earliest phase, the Old Kingdom phase of Egyptian religion, this was their belief about most people. Now, pharaohs, the rulers, were different because pharaohs were considered to be part divine. So when pharaohs died, the divine part of them got to go back to where the other gods lived, and they got to have an afterlife. They got to be they got to have servants and have, their boats and their food and all that stuff. That's why in the Old Kingdom period, for a couple of hundred years, Egypt went through a fad, and it was really a fad. It went through a fad of pyramid building, where they built these massive tombs, and they started off building kind of smallish pyramids and kind of shitty ones, and they got better and better at it, and they started building bigger and bigger pyramids, and everyone who's like, oh, the aliens must have helped them build it. It's like, no, we literally can see the evolution of pyramid building in the Old Kingdom period. We have the smaller, crappy ones, and we have the ones that are in the middle, and we got the big ones right at the end of the period, and we've got the whole thing. We've got the ones that they messed up. There's one called the Bent Pyramid, and that's a pyramid that they messed up on. So that's pretty funny. But yeah, for a couple of hundred years in the Old Kingdom period, Egypt went through a fad of building huge monumental tombs to the pharaohs as a way of honoring these god people that the pharaohs were, and making sure that they had access to all the stuff they would need going into the afterlife, that they were going to have and everyone else wasn't. So that's the early phase of Egyptian religious development. And as I said, it's not super different, except for the pyramid building. It's not super different from what religion in Mesopotamia would have been like. In Mesopotamia, they also did not believe in an afterlife of any sort or any real sort. There's just sort of a storage space for what's left of your soul. And anyway, so what was I going to say? Oh, yeah. So that's where they were in the Old Kingdom period. Now, over time, in the Middle Kingdom period, they weren't building pyramids anymore. So that's the thing. Pyramid building only went on for a few hundred years during the Old Kingdom period, which means that it's not an Egyptian thing. It's just a very Like, it's just a very small part of Egyptian history where they built pyramids. 3,000 years, and the pyramid building lasted for like 200, which is bonkers. That's like the same thing as, um, that's like the same thing as a fad that lasts like 10 or 15 years in America. In the scope of 250 years of American history, if something lasted 15 years, that would be similar. So you might say that, uh, gosh, Video arcades were about as significant to American history as pyramids were to Egyptian history. Um, you know. Anyway, um, so in the Middle Kingdom period, Egyptian religious belief had evolved to the point where they believed that everyone, even lowly piss ants like you and me, had an afterlife. But, there's a catch, there's always a catch. This afterlife that everyone got was just doing what they did in life. So if you were a farmer in your life, when you died, you go into an afterlife where you farm your heaven fields or whatever. It's not heaven or hell, but you farm the afterlife fields so that the afterlife pharaoh can enjoy food. Isn't that depressing? I mean, you can kind of see how it grows out of the Egyptian idea that nothing ever changes, right? The Egyptians had this belief that nothing ever really changes. So you can kind of see how they developed this idea that when you die, you just go on doing exactly what you did in life. And there's this whole other society that exists on the other side of the veil of death. But I find it depressing as hell. I love my job, and I would still be depressed if this was what I had to do for eternity. You know? You dig? If nothing else ever happened, I would be very depressed. And I say that as if I'm not going to keep teaching until I drop dead in front of a class. Like, that's actually my plan. Like, my retirement plan is to just die in the middle of a lesson. Um, Hopefully when I'm like 90 or something, but anyway. I'm going to be super old and super crotchety, and I'm going to be the teacher no one wants to get. So anyway. But where was... Oh, yeah. So nothing ever changes. Nothing ever changes. Um, this idea that when you die, you just go on doing what you do. Now, that is a new development, mind you. That sounds depressing to us, and it sounds simplistic to us, but the Egyptians are probably the first people on the planet to come up with this idea that there is an afterlife of some kind. During this period, they built what were called necropolises, which is one of the weirdest things that I think I've ever heard of. If there was a city or a settlement on one side of the Nile River, on the opposite side of the river, they would build a duplicate of that town, like empty buildings and stuff, that was called a necropolis. That was where all the people who were dead were supposed to live. Well, live. I say where the dead live. That sounds silly, but you know what I mean. It's where all the dead people were. It's not like they buried them there either. It's just thought that's where their spirits went. And they needed all the same buildings and stuff that you needed in the regular city because they had to go on doing all the same jobs that they did in life. And people wonder why the ancient Egyptians were thought to be weird by every other culture. Anyway. But the Egyptians during the Middle Kingdom come up with the concept of the afterlife, basically. They're the first people. The afterlife that they came up with kind of sucks, but it was the first one. So, give them credit. And in the New Kingdom period, The New Kingdom period, remember the three periods there, the Old, Middle, and New Kingdom periods. Um, Old, Middle, New Kingdom period. In the New Kingdom period, um, Egyptian religion evolves sort of one last time, and in the next logical step of evolution, um, they develop, they're the first people to do this, by the way. This is the earliest we see this happen. The Egyptians developed the concept of a reward in the afterlife. Like either you did well and you were a good human, or you were a bad human and you get poorly and you get punished, like eaten by crocodiles for all eternity or whatever. That's really one of the ways you can be punished in the Egyptian afterlife, eaten by crocodiles for all eternity. So anyway, their version of their idea of hell was, yeah, there were lots of different hells depending on what you did. But anyway, but yeah, but if you were good, you could be rewarded in the afterlife. And you could live a nice, pleasant existence where you got, to enjoy a sort of paradise-like place. Now, to us, that sounds pretty commonplace because Egyptian or because Christian religion, which is very common in this culture, has popularized this idea of the afterlife as either a punishment or a reward. But the Egyptians were the first people to think of that. The Egyptians, no one else had come up with this idea. The Egyptians were the first people to come up with it. And thus, arguably, by the ending of the sort of evolutionary period of Egyptian religious thought, by the time we get sort of the final phase of it, the Egyptians are arguably the first people to develop a moral concept of religion, however rudimentary it was. Okay, so, okay, let me, there we go. And one more thing. So now let's talk about the legacy of Egypt. Okay. And by the way, I want to say, you could teach a whole semester on Egypt. This is sounding a little rushed and a little compacted because it is. I had to whittle Egypt down to one lesson, which is bonkers. You can spend a whole semester talking about Egypt and still not really do it justice. So, we're just going to take what we can get from this and move on. But yeah, it's really quite a rich and fascinating history that we're glossing over here. 3,000 years worth of history. What was the legacy of Egypt? Well, okay. In the Old Kingdom period and the Middle Kingdom period, arguably, Egypt didn't have much of an impact on the world around it. And purposely so. The Egyptians were isolated, and they wanted to be isolated. They liked doing things their way, in their weird little isolated pocket of the world, and that was it. That was just the way things were done. Egypt got on with its business, as it were. In the New Kingdom era, Egypt spread outside of its own borders and acquired colonies. And it also began to have a lot more significant interaction with the other societies in the Mediterranean around it, especially people like the early Greeks, the Mycenaeans, and the Hittites. During the New Kingdom period, Egypt also develops, of course, as mentioned, this idea of a moral concept of religion and the afterlife as reward or punishment. I don't think it's a coincidence that other cultures start developing this idea of an afterlife that is good or bad, depending on whether you were good or bad. That starts to show up in other places after Egypt starts reaching out beyond its own borders. We owe that probably to the Egyptians. The Egyptians were the first people in the New Kingdom period, again, to experiment with monotheism. It didn't last, but there was an Egyptian pharaoh in the New Kingdom era who tried to get rid of the worship of all the gods except for one version of the sun god that he claimed to be the child of. Now, his reasons for doing it had nothing to do with theology. His reasons for trying to get rid of the worship of the other gods had to do with the fact that the priests of those gods have become very powerful in that period. And if he could get people to stop worshiping the other gods, then the priests would lose their power, and he could rule Egypt without having to deal with these annoying priests. And that's why when he died, everybody went right back to doing it the way they'd always done it before, and pretended it never happened. But yeah, it's after Egypt starts having an impact on cultures around it that we get monotheism, that we get the idea of afterlife as reward or punishment. It's after that we get certain kinds of trigonometry and geometry that the Egyptians had been using for thousands of years in their engineering, right? I mean, the Pythagorean theorem, which I know that some math teacher must have annoyed you with it at some point in your life. The Pythagorean theorem is originally an Egyptian mathematical theorem. Egypt was a society of incredibly advanced engineers. They had advanced and deep thoughts about religion and cosmology. But they mostly kept to themselves, and these thoughts filtered out little by little over the course of their history, and mostly during the New Kingdom period. After the end of the New Kingdom period, after the Bronze Age collapse that ended that, they kind of went back to keeping to themselves, and then got conquered by Alexander, and then by Rome, and that was the ball game. Egypt's legacy is weird in that sense. They did not have a direct influence on the development of Western society, but they probably indirectly influenced it in a number of very important ways. One last little bit of influence that they had, which happened thousands of years after Egypt stopped being Egypt as it understood itself, is that in the late 1700s, when Napoleon was conquering everything, one of the places he conquered was Egypt. And Napoleon thought that he was going to be emperor forever. So everywhere he went, he took scholars with him to study his new acquisitions. Like when he conquered Egypt, he brought scholars with him to study Egypt, so that he would, when he ruled it, he would understand what he was ruling. Anyway, one of Napoleon's officers discovered an artifact that helped them translate the hieroglyphs, which at that point in time, remember this is the 1700s, nobody had known how to translate hieroglyphs for, thousands of years at this point. So no one knew what all that stuff said. So they discovered how to translate hieroglyphs. And in the 1800s, a bunch of people who now knew how to translate hieroglyphs went to Egypt and started to translate all of the inscriptions that were all over all of the old tombs and palaces, things like that. And they started learning about Egyptian history. And they started studying all of these old artifacts to reconstruct this lost history of Egypt. And they started thinking about it more systematically. They started thinking, hey, maybe there's a science to this, a way that we could study old societies in general, not just Egypt. Maybe we could dig up what's left of old societies and try to piece together what they were like. And basically, because of Egypt, they invented archaeology. The early people who studied Egypt weren't called archaeologists because it hadn't been invented yet. They were called Egyptologists, Egypt studiers. It was out of Egyptology that archaeology developed. So that's a weird legacy of Egypt. But anyway, okay. So, awesome. That was Egypt. That was my one lesson capsule version of Egypt. Hopefully you enjoyed it. And that is that. So, make sure that you can answer the questions on Egypt. Yay. Bye.